After 15 years of loyalty, they thought they could throw me away like nothing. What they didn't know? I saw it coming, and I had the perfect plan for revenge. The conference room was silent as Mark Reynolds sat across from his boss, Mr. Holloway, the man he had worked under for the past 15 years. Mark already knew what was coming. The tension, the forced smiles, the way HR had been whispering behind closed doors for weeks. And yet, they still thought they had the upper hand. Mr. Holloway cleared his throat, pretending to look sympathetic. Mark, you've been a valuable asset to this company. Here it comes. But, Holloway continued, we've decided to move in a new direction. Your position has been eliminated. Effective immediately. Mark exhaled slowly, forcing himself to look surprised. Just like that? He asked, tilting his head. 15 years of loyalty and you're cutting me loose? Holloway gave a fake sigh. It's not personal, Mark. Just business. Mark almost laughed. Not personal? This company had been his entire life. He had built departments from the ground up, trained employees who were now managers, landed deals that had made Holloway richer than he deserved. And now, they were discarding him like an old office chair. But what Holloway didn't know, Mark had seen this coming months ago. And he had already put a plan in motion. So instead of begging, instead of arguing, he simply smiled. Holloway frowned. You're taking this well. Mark leaned forward, his smirk sending a chill through the room. Oh, I'm taking it just fine. In fact, I think you're going to have a much bigger problem soon. Holloway blinked, confusion flickering in his eyes. Excuse me. Mark straightened his tie, grabbed his briefcase, and stood. You'll find out soon enough. Then, without another word, he walked out. Because what Holloway and the entire company didn't know, Mark Reynolds wasn't leaving empty-handed. He had taken something with him. And when they realized what it was, they'd regret ever letting him go. 1 week later, the boardroom was in chaos. Mr. Holloway sat at the head of the long conference table, his face grey red with frustration. Around him, executives whispered frantically, flipping through reports, eyes wide with panic. Mark Reynolds was everywhere. Holloway slammed his hand on the table. How the hell did this happen? A nervous-looking analyst cleared his throat. Sir, the moment Mark left, 3 of our biggest clients pulled their contracts. And this morning, he swallowed hard. He launched his own company. Silence. Holloway's blood ran cold. Mark Reynolds wasn't just gone. He had taken the company's biggest clients with him. The boardroom doors swung open, and Holloway's assistant rushed in, looking like she'd seen a ghost. Sir, you need to see this. She turned on the massive TV screen mounted on the wall. A live press conference was playing. And there, standing confidently in front of a backdrop with from his own company's logo, was Aswant's Mark Reynolds. He adjusted his tie and faced the cameras. For 15 years, I dedicated my life to a company that discarded me overnight. But they forgot one thing. I built the relationships, I made the deals. I created the foundation they stand on. Mark smirked. And now, I'm taking it all with me. Reporters shouted questions, but Mark simply smiled. Reynolds Consulting is officially open for business, and to my former employer. He leaned slightly toward the mic. You should have seen this coming. The screen went black. The room was silent. Holloway felt like the air had been knocked from his lungs. Mark Reynolds hadn't just walked away. He had set fire to everything on his way out. And as reality sank in, Holloway realized something terrifying. Mark wasn't just his former employee. He was now his biggest competition. And worst of all, Mark was winning. 1 month later, Mr. Holloway sat in his office, staring at the latest financial reports. His company was bleeding. Profits were down 40%. Clients were leaving in waves. Employees were jumping ship, some even going to work for Mark Reynolds. His fingers curled into fists. How had everything collapsed so quickly? A knock on his door made him look up. His assistant walked in, looking pale and hesitant. "Sir, he's here." Holloway's stomach twisted. "Who?" She swallowed. "Mark Reynolds." Silence. Then, through the open doorway, Mark walked in. Dressed in a sharp custom suit, his confidence radiated off him. He looked like a man who had already won. And Holloway looked like a man who had lost everything. Mark smirked, taking a seat across from him. "Did you miss me, boss?" Holloway's jaw clenched. "What do you want?" Mark leaned forward, his smirk never fading. "Simple. I want you to watch while I finish what I started." Holloway exhaled sharply. "You think you've won, don't you?" Mark chuckled. "Oh, I don't think, Holloway. I know." He leaned back, tapping his fingers against the chair. "See, you thought I was just another replaceable employee. But you forgot. I was the one keeping this place afloat. I built the trust. I closed the deals. I made you rich." His voice lowered, deadly calm. "And now, I'm taking it all back." Holloway's face darkened. "You won't destroy me?" Mark stood, buttoning his suit jacket. "I don't have to." He slid a folder across the desk. Holloway opened it, and his face turned ghostly white. It was an acquisition offer. From Reynolds Consulting. Mark smiled. "You're finished, Holloway. And now your company? It's mine." Holloway's hands shook as he stared at the papers. Mark leaned down, his voice a whisper. "Next time, remember, never underestimate the man you tried to discard." With that, Mark turned and walked out of the office. For the last time. And as Holloway sat there, stunned and defeated, he realized Mark Reynolds hadn't just won. He had made sure they'd never forget his name. Domstula. 6 months later. The once great Holloway Enterprises no longer existed. Its massive glass headquarters now bore a new name. Reynolds Consulting. Mark Reynolds stood at the top floor, gazing out over the city skyline, his hands in his pockets. This was his now. All of it. Behind him, his assistant cleared her throat. "Mr. Reynolds, the final transition paperwork has been signed. It's officially yours." Mark nodded, a slow smirk forming. "Good." It was poetic justice. The company that once tossed him aside now belonged to him. Holloway? After signing the deal, he disappeared from the business world entirely. No headlines, no big exit, just a quiet, humiliating fall from grace. And Mark? He was only getting started. As he turned away from the window, his assistant handed him a folder. "Your 2 p.m. meeting is waiting in the boardroom." Mark arched an eyebrow. "Who is it?" She hesitated. "An old colleague, someone who didn't believe in you back then. Now, they want a job." Mark chuckled. Of course they did. He adjusted his cuffs and strode toward the boardroom, his footsteps echoing with power. Because now, he wasn't just a former employee. He was the man they all answered to. And as he stepped through the doors, one thing was certain. Mark Reynolds hadn't just won. He had taken everything. 1 year later, Mark Reynolds sat at the head of a long, polished conference table in the boardroom of Reynolds Consulting. The room was packed, executives, managers, even former rivals, all waiting for his next move. He tapped his fingers on the table, taking in the faces around him. Some of them had doubted him, some had betrayed him, and now they worked for him. A presentation flashed on the massive screen in front of them. Projections, expansions, new markets. Mark took a deep breath, then looked up. 1 year ago, I took over a failing company that underestimated me. Now, we're the fastest growing consulting firm in the country. The room nodded in agreement, some shifting nervously. Everyone knew what had happened to Holloway Enterprises. Mark smirked. But we're not stopping there. He clicked to the next slide. A new acquisition proposal. A bigger company. A global expansion. The executives whispered. This was bold, ruthless. But Mark Reynolds didn't play small. He leaned forward. We're going to dominate this industry. And if anyone in this room isn't ready for that, there's the door. Silence. No one moved. Because they all knew the truth. Standing against Mark Reynolds was a mistake no one wanted to make. His assistant stepped in, whispering in his ear. Sir, your next guest is here. Mark nodded, standing. That'll be all for today. Get it done. As the executives hurried out, Mark walked toward his private office where his guest was waiting. He stepped inside and froze. Sitting across from his desk, looking nervous yet determined, was Holloway. Mark smirked, closing the door behind him. Well, well, look who finally decided to show up. Holloway cleared his throat. Mark, I made mistakes. Mark chuckled, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. No kidding. Holloway exhaled. I need a job. Mark paused mid-sip, amusement flickering in his eyes. You? Want to work for me? Holloway nodded slowly. I built companies, I know this industry. Mark held up a hand, cutting him off. I don't need your resume. He walked around the desk, leaning against it, looking down at the man who once threw him away like nothing. For a long moment, Mark just stared. Then he smirked. Number Holloway's face fell. Mark, please. Mark straightened. You didn't believe in second chances when it was me. Why should I offer you one now? Silence. Holloway had no answer. Mark walked to the door, holding it open. Enjoy retirement. Defeated, Holloway slowly stood, his shoulders slumped. He knew there was no convincing Mark. As the former CEO walked out of the office, Mark sat back in his chair, sipping his drink, watching the city he now owned. He had gotten his revenge. But more importantly, he had built something greater than they ever thought possible, and now, the world belonged to Mark Reynolds.